The Oracl3 Network.
Murder, She Spoke is a true crime podcast hosted by me, Joanna Shanks.
And me, Emma Taylor. Each week we bring you a new case with a particular focus on crimes committed in Scotland, chosen by us or suggested by our listeners. The cases we cover typically involve violent assaults and murder, and listener discretion is advised.
We discuss each case in detail, looking at the psychological and legal elements, and end each episode on a light note. Listen to us today on your podcast platform of choice, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Hey, Rainbow Warriors. This is my disclaimer. Beyond the Rainbow is a true crime podcast. It's not suitable for young children, and maybe not even for some adults. I tend to swear like a sailor, and I'm kind of proud of that. Listener discretion is advised. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors. Welcome to Beyond the Rainbow. True crimes of the LGBTQ+. I'm your host, CJ. Find me on the socials, Facebook or Instagram at Beyond the Rainbow, or on Twitter, TikTok, and Tumblr at Rainbow Crimes. And check out my website at beyondtherainbowpodcast.com. There you can find a gallery of photos from past cases, links to my Rainbow Crimes merch store at TeePublic, and to my Buy Me a Coffee link, should you happen to want to help support the show. You'll also find a list of missing but not forgotten LGBTQ+ people. This episode's missing but not forgotten LGBTQ+ person is 28-year-old Gage Matthew Robberts. Gage went missing 2 to 3 years ago from Zanesville, Ohio. Now, I'm just going to get right into it and level with you, Rainbow Warriors. This beautiful missing man stands a very good chance to be found, alive, and he most likely disappeared on his own. His mom just needs to know he's okay and get him the help he needs. Remember how we've talked about how sometimes people pick up coping mechanisms that maybe aren't the healthiest for him? Gage did just that, and he turned to meth. I want to assure you he didn't leave because his family wasn't accepting of his gay lifestyle. They're very supportive. His mom, Kelly, has described Gage as a free spirit, someone who never really stays anywhere very long. Now, with his coping mechanism habit that I shared with you, his mom is extra worried about his well-being. She feels that Gage may be living out among the homeless population, possibly in a tent city. She received word not too long ago that he could be in Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, or somewhere in California. I know, warriors, a needle in a haystack, and it's not 100% he's in any of those places. But if we can all just keep our eyes open and try to spot him, that would be wonderful. Gage stands between 5'10" and 6 feet tall. He weighs between 160 and 170 pounds. He has a pierced ear on the left side, maybe one on the right, and he has a tat of a marijuana leaf on his wrist. Gage is also a drag queen performer and has performed under the name of Gypsy Monroe Romanov. And Gypsy's quite beautiful, as Gage is very handsome. So warriors, if you could check out my website for pictures of Gage, both in and out of drag, I'd sure appreciate it. His mom has filed a missing persons report with her local police. Any information you might have leading to Gage's whereabouts, please call or text Kelly at 740-901-8356. But please don't prank her. Some asshole already has. He claimed to have abducted Gage and wouldn't give him back without a ransom. The IP came from somewhere in South Africa. Pranking a parent over their missing child is fucking lower than low. Every year during Pride Month, I do a lot of reflecting on the advocates and the activists, the ones that have helped make life a little bit better for my community. Many of these people have died for LGBTQ+ rights. Their power in death has given us power in life. Some of those who have been killed were killed for just living their truth. They didn't realize they were unwittingly activists fighting for our rights. The result of their death has kicked others into gear to adopt protective laws for the LGBTQ+ community. The fight for these rights is real. It's an ever-long battle as long as hate exists. This episode's case is a Rainbow Warrior recommendation, all the way from Australia. Listener Phoenix was kind enough to let me know about this case and told me this case is what started law reform for the LGBTQ+ members in Australia. Oddly enough, though, our story doesn't start in Australia. It begins in Golders Green, London on July 20th, 1930. That day, a little boy was born to the New Zealander couple of Hazel and Ronald. The parents named the little boy George Ian Ogilvie Duncan. Such a regal name for such a little baby. As we all know, though, babies grow quickly. George grew into his name. Other than when George was 7, he and his family moved to Melbourne, Australia, not much more has been documented about his childhood. George would graduate high school at the age of 17. He immediately headed off to the University of Melbourne to study philology. Let me let you in on a secret. I didn't know what philology was. But if I was put on the spot and asked, I'd say it was the study of guys named Phil. Duh. It's not. Google told me it's the study of the structure and historical development of languages. And you can file that into the calculus category of things I just don't give a fuck about. I'd never be able to get through one class, let alone earn a whole degree on the topic. George was already 3 years in on his philology studies when he contracted a nasty case of tuberculosis. You know, tuberculosis seems kind of like the old-timey version of the coronavirus, actually. It's a bacteria that attacks the lungs first, but it can harm other organs. And it's highly contagious through coughs, sneezes, and even talking. Tuberculosis is still around, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it used to be. George was only 20 when he contracted tuberculosis. It got so bad he had to have one of his lungs removed. After that, George was inevitably a very frail man. It took him 7 years to get well enough to continue his studies. By then, he decided he wanted to head back to his birth country of England for schooling. At the age of 27, George applied and was accepted to the St. John's College in Cambridge. Here he studied and graduated with a doctorate. It wasn't in the study of guys named Phil. It was in law. George then taught law at Bristol University in England. His colleagues thought George was a mystery, which I think might have been a nice way of saying they thought George was an oddball. He was tall, slender, had curly blondish hair and blue eyes. He also wore some extremely thick-framed black glasses, and he was painfully shy. George was also very socially awkward. He didn't know how to have normal small-talk conversations. In fact, engaging in any conversation not related to academics was very difficult for him. In 1970, at the age of 40, George joined a group called Gaytime Friendship Society in London. That sounds fun. I'd like to start one of those here. But I guess George's wasn't that fun because 2 years later, George moved back to Australia. He took a lecturership at the University of Adelaide. While homosexuality was decriminalized in England in 1967, being gay in Australia was still very much illegal. George had been teaching at the University of Adelaide less than 2 months when he learned that the south bank of the River Torrens was a gay beat. The Adelaide police knew it as the number 1 beat. And as you probably remember from an earlier episode, a gay beat is a secluded area where men meet each other for sexual encounters. It just might be called other things in other countries. Under the cover of darkness on May 10, 1972, George decided to visit the gay beat by the river. Around 11 p.m., George and another man named Roger James were assaulted. Then they were thrown over a bridge into the River Torrens by 4 men. Along with George and Roger, there was actually a 3rd man that was tossed over the bridge as well. His identity has been withheld, possibly because he had a wife and a family, and the other possibility is no one could ever find him again. The water at the river ranges from 1 to 9 feet deep. Roger James broke his ankle upon impact, but he was able to swim to the side of the embankment. The 3rd unnamed victim also swam to safety, but he disappeared after. But Dr. George Duncan? He'd never learned how to swim, and he only had 1 lung, so he wasn't able to float for long either. Desperately flailing his arms in the water, George ended up drowning. When Roger pulled himself out of the water, he scrambled up a hill to the road. He was able to flag down a passing car. The driver got out to help Roger and drive him to the hospital. The driver of that car was the future convicted child murderer and suspected serial killer, Bevan von Einem. Having no way of knowing this, Roger took the ride anyway and arrived safely at the hospital. There he was treated for his injuries. Ironically, it was Bevan von Einem who contacted the police about the attack at the bridge. Now that I mentioned him, we're going to have to save Bevan, who had a penchant for boys that were between the ages of 14 and 25, for another episode someday. When the police arrived at the bridge, they and some bystanders pulled George's body from the river. But then they had to put George back in again because the TV news reporters and cameras showed up. The news wanted film of George being pulled from the river. I think it was extremely unprofessional of the police to allow this. It was a crime scene, for shit's sakes. However, George's murder gained a lot of traction in the news media, and soon it was rumored that members of the police vice squad were responsible for the attack. When the officers were named, they were brought in for an inquest. Constables Francis Cawley and Michael Clayton, along with Senior Constable Brian Hudson, were the named police officers. The 4th man with them was said to be a really tall guy, and he was never identified. The 3 officers brought in refused to cooperate with the investigation. So Scotland Yard was called in, which, by the way, I learned not too long ago. Scotland Yard isn't in Scotland at all. It's in England, and it's the building that houses the Metropolitan Police. It's named that because the building is located on a street called Great Scotland Yard. And because the public entrance is on that street, the Metropolitan Police Department became known as Scotland Yard. I do think it's kind of strange that South Australia would call in another country's police detectives to check out their crime. But maybe because the allegation was about police corruption, they felt impartial law enforcement would be the best for this case. The only thing that the accused officers really said, the poofter bashing was just a frolic gone wrong. No one was meant to die. Pardon me, but dancing naked through a garden of tulips is a frolic. Poofter bashing is not a frolic. Gay bashing is a homophobic fucking hate crime. It seemed these 3 cops weren't going to put their big boy pants on and own up to their crimes. A formal inquest was called against them. Roger James, the victim who was tossed from the bridge and broke his ankle, he couldn't, or should I say wouldn't, testify against the officers. Roger was in fear of retaliation from the police. He pretty much just clammed up about the night. The findings from the Scotland Yard detectives were never made public, and the Crown Court decided against proceeding with criminal charges of the officers. They said there wasn't enough evidence. Although it's been speculated this incident was a huge police cover-up. Parts of Australian communities were outraged by this verdict. Liberal lawmakers began to enact bills to protect the LGBTQ+ community. It all happened in baby steps, with some of the anti-LGBTQ laws being shut down in certain states and territories. The evolution of new laws of protection was starting to begin. 13 years after George's murder, an ex-vice cop named Mick O'Shea came forward publicly. He announced to media that indeed there was a cover-up in the police force. He made the allegations officers he knew would go out at night and find men they deemed as gay along the River Torrens. The officers would sometimes assault the gay men and then they would throw them off the bridge. With this tidbit, the 3 South Australian officers formerly accused of George's murder were again arrested, and this time they were being charged for manslaughter in 1986. The senior constable was released immediately without conflict. The other 2 officers went to trial. But again they were refusing to wear their big boy pants, and again they refused to cooperate. In 1990, the South Australian police announced that they saw no prospect for bringing anyone to justice in George Duncan's death. It took another 8 years for the remaining 2 accused officers to go to trial in 1998. At the trial, both men were acquitted of murdering George. It seemed as though the cover-up was still continuing. Goodness forbid there was anything scandalous within the South Australian police force. There would be no justice for George Duncan's murder. No one would ever be convicted for this heinous crime. All that was really left of George was a file on him at the University of Adelaide, one black and white photo of him, and a tattered briefcase. The news media is what brought George to light. And because of this, his death did spark laws to protect the LGBTQ+ community. By 1997, every state and territory had these laws in place. Even the areas like Tasmania that were dragging their heels to comply. LGBTQ+ activists even today still call for a royal commission into the events that led to George's death. But there's no one listening. There will never be any justice for George. But maybe we should feel that George died for the greater good, so that people of the LGBTQ+ community can live a richer life in Australia. There's a memorial monument dedicated to the memory of George next to the River Torrens. It reads, "In memory of Dr. George Duncan, whose death by drowning on the 10th of May 1972 near here at the hands of persons unconvicted precipitated homosexual law reform in South Australia, making it the first state in Australia in 1975 to decriminalize homosexual relations." Thank you, Dr. George Duncan. I'd like to end this episode with a new segment I want to start doing. I call it a quickie. Basically, it's a rainbow crime that was either served unicorn justice or it still needs unicorn justice. It's a shorter case with not enough information to make it a complete episode. The victim's story, however, still needs to be told. This episode's quickie case is one that is still in search of unicorn justice. It was New Year's Eve and New Year's Day 2020. Rover Taxi Service in McAlester, Oklahoma, offered their customers a ride to the bars at regular full fare price, but their ride home would be free. It seemed like a great marketing strategy. 25-year-old trans man Dustin Parker drove for Rover Taxi. He agreed to work New Year's Day for the company. Dustin was a family man. He had a wife named Regina, and together the couple had 4 children. For the young couple, they spent New Year's Eve tucking the children into bed early and then watching a movie together. And because Dustin had to be up so early to drive, they called it an early night. It was 3 a.m., just 3 hours into 2020. That's when Dustin's alarm went off. He had to get up to drive. Regina woke up and saw Dustin off, and then she went back to sleep. Dustin came back home about 6 a.m. Regina was up with the kids. Dustin used the bathroom and asked Regina if she would put a sweater on their dog. Then Dustin received a call from a passenger at 6:19. The passenger urged Dustin to hurry. The passenger called back at 6:20, again telling Dustin to hurry. Dustin was agitated and he felt very pressured. Normally, Dustin would have plenty of time to give his wife a hug, a kiss, and an I love you. But this particular morning, he rushed out the door telling Regina he'd see her later that night. At 6:30 a.m., Dustin was found shot to death in his Rover taxi. It was on the 200 block of West Delaware Avenue in McAlester, Oklahoma. Dustin had been hit multiple times by gunfire, and he was left dead in the driver's seat. His wife Regina wasn't even able to give him an open casket funeral because the coroner told her that Dustin had no face left. Regina still struggles daily to come to terms that she and her kids, they'll never see Dustin again. The kids have been put into trauma counseling, and all of them are dealing with their dad's death a little differently. Their eldest boy, he has stepped into assuming the man of the house role, while their 12-year-old daughter still battles with the fear of what happened. There's been multiple fundraisers for Dustin's family to help Regina pay rent, help to feed the kids, and keep them well. Dustin's murder has not been solved. But what happened? It was only 10 minutes from Dustin getting the second call from the person who told him to hurry to Dustin being murdered. A person of interest was detained and questioned but later released. And there's been no new leads that have been publicized. Officers canvassed the area it happened. They knocked on doors, interviewed potential witnesses, and followed up on possible leads. But nothing has turned up any substance. Police are hesitant to say Dustin was murdered because he was trans. Because let's face it, they're always hesitant to call anything a hate crime. I'll keep watching for updates on this case, warriors. But in the meantime, should you be listening and have any information on the murder of Dustin Parker, please call the McAlester, Oklahoma police at 918-423-1212. Love you, Rainbow Warriors. And remember, it's not a crime to be LGBTQ+, unless you're a murderer.